Arkansas, 1943. The cattle trucks rolled to a stop beneath a sky so wide it swallowed fear whole, and 24 German soldiers climbed down onto American soil expecting chains. Instead, they found cotton fields stretching to the horizon and farmers who offered cold water from tin cups. These were the defeated soldiers of Rommel's Africa Corps, men who had crossed an ocean as prisoners expecting brutality. What they discovered in the Arkansas Delta would shatter every belief the Third Reich had burned into their minds. This is the story of how kindness defeated hate, one sunrise at a time. North Africa, November 1942. The Desert Fox had been outflanked. When the guns fell silent across Tunisia and Libya, over 20,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered to Allied forces. They expected immediate execution. Nazi propaganda had been clear about American savagery. Instead, they found themselves loaded onto Liberty ships bound for an ocean crossing that would take 3 weeks. Below deck, Werner Gebauer, a 23-year-old corporal from Bremen, pressed against the hull and listened to the engines churn. He had seen the newsreels. Americans were brutal. Cowboys, gangsters. He touched the small photograph of his mother in his pocket and wondered if he would survive the voyage. The meals aboard ship confused them. Thick beef stew, fresh bread, fruit. Gebauer whispered to Fritz Becker in the bunk beside him that perhaps the Americans were fattening them like cattle before slaughter. It was the only explanation that made sense. They arrived at ports in New York and Virginia, processed through facilities where American soldiers checked their papers with bureaucratic efficiency rather than violence. Then came the trains, Pullman cars with cushioned seats that reclined, windows that showed a country untouched by war, cities with lights blazing, farmland rolling past like something from a dream. Helmut Schultz, pressed against the glass somewhere in Missouri, watched American children playing baseball in a schoolyard. The train slowed through a small town, and he saw a woman hanging laundry on a line, humming. The war had not reached here. It existed only in the newspapers these people read with their morning coffee. The heat hit them first. January in Arkansas felt like summer in Germany, thick and wet and alive with insects they had never seen. The train stopped at a small station near Stuttgart, and they were loaded onto military trucks with canvas covers that did nothing to block the sun. Camp Robinson sprawled across farmland north of Little Rock. Guard towers, barbed wire. Rows of wooden barracks that looked temporary, thrown together quickly to house the unexpected flood of prisoners. Nearly 4,000 men would eventually pass through these gates. The Germans climbed down from the trucks and stood in formation, waiting for the brutality to begin. Lieutenant Colonel Virgil Caldwell walked the line inspecting them. He was older than expected, maybe 50, with a face weathered by sun and patience. He spoke slowly so the interpreters could keep pace. The barracks had bunks with mattresses. There was a mess hall serving 3 meals daily. Soccer fields had been marked out behind the camp. Anyone caught trying to escape would face punishment, but the punishment would be bread and water, not execution. Work details would begin at 7 each morning. The Germans stood silent, processing this information against everything they had been told. Gustav Menke, a sergeant who had fought across 3 countries, felt something inside him shift. This was not a death camp. This was not even a prison in any sense he understood. This was something else entirely. Morning came with a bugle call that echoed across the compound. The prisoners filed into the mess hall expecting watery gruel, the kind of starvation rations they had seen in German camps housing captured Soviets. Instead, the smell of bacon hit them like a physical thing. American cooks moved behind steam tables, piling plates with eggs scrambled in butter, thick slices of bacon that glistened with fat, toast with jam, potatoes fried golden brown. Coffee steamed in huge urns. Real coffee, not the acorn substitute they had drunk for 2 years. Werner Gebauer stood frozen, holding his tray. He looked at the American private serving food, searching for the trap. The private smiled and gestured toward the bacon. Plenty more where that came from. Gebauer took his plate to a table and sat down beside Fritz Becker, who had already begun eating with the single-minded focus of a starving man. They ate in silence, afraid that speaking would break whatever spell had produced this abundance. Around them, other prisoners did the same, bent over plates that held more food than many had seen in months. Back home, their families were rationing bread. Children went to bed hungry. And here, in enemy territory, they were eating better than they had before the war began. Rolf Tienemann wrote in his diary that evening, his hand shaking slightly from the strangeness of it all. "The Americans feed us like guests, not prisoners. I do not understand this. Nothing makes sense anymore." The Arkansas Delta spread out around Camp Robinson in endless flatness, punctuated by cotton fields that stretched to tree lines dark against the horizon. It was nothing like home. No mountains, no forests dense enough to hide in, just sky and land and heat that pressed down like a physical weight. The guards carried rifles but rarely pointed them. They joked among themselves in English the prisoners did not yet understand, smoking cigarettes and watching the Germans learn to play baseball on fields marked out behind the barracks. A few prisoners tried to teach the guards soccer in return, using a ball made from rags and string until a proper one arrived from the camp store. By the second week, Alfred Schiersch noticed something strange. The guards seemed almost embarrassed by their role. They were farm boys mostly, too young or too old for combat deployment. They treated the prisoners with awkward courtesy, like hosts uncertain of etiquette. One guard, a kid from Stuttgart, Arkansas, brought photographs of his family's dairy farm and tried to explain through gestures how much milk they produced daily. The real enemy was not the Americans. It was boredom, routine, the slow dissolution of purpose that came from having nothing to fight and nowhere to escape to. The nearest border was hundreds of miles away. The locals spoke a language most prisoners did not understand. And even if they ran, where would they go in their prison uniforms with PW stenciled in bright yellow across their backs and legs? So they settled into the rhythm of camp life. Morning roll call, breakfast, work details or camp maintenance, soccer in the afternoon when the heat broke, dinner, letters home on thin paper that took months to arrive, sleep in barracks where men dreamed of cities that no longer existed, bombed into rubble by the war they had helped start. The branch camps changed everything. By spring 1943, labor shortages had grown critical across the Arkansas Delta. Young men had gone to war or to defense plants offering wages farmers could not match. Cotton rotted in fields. Timber companies could not fill orders. The U.S. government made a decision. The prisoners would work. Gerhard Schnauze rode in the back of a truck with 11 other prisoners toward a place called WWII, 40 miles from Camp Robinson. A guard sat in front with the driver, his rifle resting casual across his knees. Through the canvas cover, Schnauze watched Arkansas pass by. Small towns with main streets lined with shops, farmhouses with porches where people sat in the evening, churches with white steeples catching the sun. The truck stopped at a farm that seemed to go on forever. Cotton fields, a main house raised on blocks against flooding, barns and equipment sheds scattered across the property. A woman in her 50s stood waiting, hands on her hips, squinting at the Germans as they climbed down. Mabel Giesek ran the Lansing Company plantation near Parkin, one of the largest operations in Cross County. She needed workers, and she needed them now. She looked at the prisoners, thin from months of transport and uncertainty, and made a decision. Anyone who picked more than 100 pounds of cotton per day would get peanut butter to smuggle back to camp. She did not care what the regulations said. The cotton fields of eastern Arkansas bore no resemblance to battlefields. No artillery thunder, no screaming, just rows of plants heavy with bolls that needed picking before the weather turned. The work was backbreaking, crawling between rows in heat that shimmered off the earth like liquid glass, dragging canvas sacks that grew heavier with each handful of cotton stuffed inside. Werner Gebauer had never picked cotton before. Most of the prisoners had not. They were mechanics, factory workers, students conscripted into service. Their hands bled the first week, cotton thorns opening cuts that would not heal in the wet heat. Some tried cheating, rolling cotton in mud to increase the weight. The gins caught them quickly, the muddied cotton jamming machinery. Those prisoners lost their work privileges and spent days on bread and water. But most learned. By midsummer, the average prisoner was picking 4 tons of cotton per day, a respectable yield. They worked from dawn until the heat broke in late afternoon, then rode back to the camps in trucks, exhausted and covered in white fuzz that clung to their clothes and hair. The farmers watched them with a mixture of necessity and grudging respect. These were the same men who had fought Allied forces across North Africa, enemy soldiers who had killed American boys. Yet here they were, keeping Arkansas farms solvent when no one else would do the work. The peanut butter became legendary. Mabel Giesecke kept her word, handing jars to prisoners who exceeded their quotas, even though Army regulations explicitly forbade such gifts. The prisoners hid the contraband in their canteens and smuggled it back to WWII camp, sharing it like treasure among friends who had not met their quotas. But peanut butter was just the beginning. Farmers across the Delta began small acts of human kindness that Army brass would later condemn as fraternization. Cold beer on the hottest days, ice cream after particularly grueling work, sandwiches packed with real meat. One farmer near Osceola invited prisoners to sit on his porch in the evening, sharing cigarettes and attempting conversation through broken English and hand gestures. The prisoners did not know what to make of it. E.D. Gregory, a prominent farmer near Parkdale in Ashley County, treated the German workers on his land with the same courtesy he showed his American employees. Fair wages, decent food, respect for work well done. When Helmut Schultz cut his hand badly on farm equipment, Gregory drove him personally to a doctor, paying for treatment from his own pocket. At night, lying in tents at the branch camps scattered across eastern Arkansas, the prisoners wrote letters home on thin paper that would take months to reach Germany. They wrote carefully, aware that censors read every word. But even in coded language, the message came through. America was not what they had been told. These people were not monsters. Fritz Becker wrote to his sister in Vienna about working on a dairy farm where the owner let prisoners drink fresh milk straight from the cooling tanks. Gustav Menke described a farm wife who packed extra sandwiches every morning, wrapping them carefully and including apples from her orchard. Werner Schmitz, writing in German that the University of Arkansas would later preserve, thanked E.D. Gregory for kindness that made no sense according to everything he had learned about Americans. The re-education program began quietly in fall 1943. The Army called it the Special Projects Division, though most people involved knew it probably violated Geneva Convention prohibitions against exposing prisoners to propaganda. The approach was subtle. A newspaper appeared in the camps, Der Ruf, edited by sympathetic German POWs. Books banned in Nazi Germany circulated through camp libraries. Discussions about democracy happened during evening hours, optional gatherings that guards monitored from a distance. Some prisoners resisted. Hardcore Nazis existed in every camp, men who intimidated others and maintained rigid discipline according to Wehrmacht rules. At Camp Dermot, the most isolated facility in Arkansas, these men enforced a code of silence. Anyone caught fraternizing too freely with Americans faced consequences after dark, beatings administered quietly where guards would not see. But the Arkansas sun and generous treatment worked a different kind of propaganda. It was hard to hate people who fed you well and treated you fairly. It was hard to maintain ideological purity when the evidence of your own eyes contradicted everything you had been taught. Werner Gebauer had believed Americans were brutal capitalists who oppressed workers and hoarded wealth. Yet he watched American GIs, many of them farm boys from places like Stuttgart, Arkansas, living in conditions barely better than the prisoners. They ate the same food, wore simple uniforms, sent money home to families struggling with wartime rationing. Where were the mansions? Where was the decadence? Edwin Pells, years later, would write a memoir describing his time in northeastern Arkansas. He remembered how we were treated in a kindly and Christian manner. Unless a person has experienced what we did, it is difficult to appreciate what a sandwich, a smile, or an encouraging word really can mean. His words, published in the Arkansas Historical Quarterly decades after the war, captured something that statistics and official reports could not. The simple power of human decency to defeat hate. The prisoners became part of the landscape. Children in towns like Wynne and Jonesboro grew up seeing German POWs working on farms, clear-cutting timber, building structures at the local college. Barbara Stevens, 9 years old at the time, remembered seeing them from the car as her family drove past the Jonesboro camp on Caraway Road. She did not feel afraid, even knowing her uncle was a prisoner in Germany at the same time. The prisoners built things that would outlast the war. In 1943, German POWs constructed the Maness School, their work commemorated by a stone marker that still stands. They improved the sewer system in Wilson, Arkansas. They marked out football fields at Arkansas State College and drove tractors for the physical plant. They built a baseball field in Hot Springs and maintained lawns on Bathhouse Row in Hot Springs National Park. At Camp Hot Springs, Felix R. Gabriel worked as a dishwasher at the Arlington Hotel, where he could eat American food to his heart's content. A former Luftwaffe airman, Gabriel would later earn a doctorate in law from the University of Vienna. When he returned to Arkansas decades later with his wife, he told an interviewer, "Well treated? Yeah. If I think I would be in Russia, it would be horrible. There in Hot Springs, it was wonderful." The contrast hung unspoken in every conversation. The prisoners knew what happened in Soviet camps. They heard whispers of mass deaths, starvation, brutal labor conditions that killed thousands. And here they were in Arkansas, eating bacon and eggs, playing soccer in their free time, earning 80 cents a day to spend in camp stores on cigarettes and candy. Christmas 1944. The war raged across Europe, but in Arkansas, the POW camps prepared for the holiday with an enthusiasm that confused both prisoners and guards. German traditions mixed with American excess. Christmas trees appeared in mess halls. Special meals were planned featuring turkey and ham, luxuries most prisoners had not seen in years. At Camp Robinson, arrangements were made for a special entertainment. Lena Horne, one of America's most celebrated black performers, would give a concert for the troops. The seating arrangements followed standard military segregation protocols of the time. German POWs would sit in front. Black American soldiers would be relegated to the rear of the hall. Lena Horne walked onto that stage and saw the arrangement. She saw enemy prisoners of war given preferential treatment over American soldiers whose only crime was the color of their skin. Years later in her autobiography, she would describe the fury that choked her. "I marched down off that platform and turned my back on the POWs and sang a few songs to the Negro guys in the back of the hall. But by the third or fourth song, I was too choked up with anger and humiliation to go on." The incident revealed a bitter truth about wartime Arkansas. The Germans were the conquered enemy, but they were still privileged by the color of their skin. Jim Crow laws that governed every aspect of Southern life applied to American citizens but not to Nazi soldiers. The contradiction was not lost on anyone paying attention, though it would take years before anyone spoke openly about it. For the German prisoners, the incident revealed yet another layer of American complexity. This was not the United Nation of propaganda films. This was a country wrestling with its own contradictions, trying to export democracy while maintaining systems of oppression at home. Despite regulations against fraternization, friendships formed. Human nature could not be legislated away. Guards and prisoners found common ground in shared interests. A love of soccer, mechanical skill, a similar sense of humor that transcended language barriers. Joe Cam, who guarded prisoners at one of the camps, would later admit he helped prisoners sell oil paintings and wood carvings to local people, directly violating published orders. The artwork itself became a form of communication. Landscapes painted from memory showing the Germany these men had left behind, wood carvings of religious figures, chess sets made from scrap lumber. These objects, illegal under Army regulations, now sit in homes across Arkansas, tangible evidence of connections that should not have existed. Frank Sloan was just a child when German POWs worked on his father's farm in Greene County. He watched them saw trees down by hand and clear land for new fields. They were young men, he would remember decades later. Just like ours were over there. They were young men, they weren't villains. The guards learned enough German to issue simple commands. The prisoners learned enough English to understand instructions and crack jokes. Power dynamics shifted subtly over time. The interpreters, English-speaking prisoners who initially held significant influence, found their authority declining as direct communication became possible. Dr. Hans Zenholz, a German economist who would later become a prominent academic in America, worked at Lee Wilson Farms Dairy during his time as a POW. The work gave him perspective on American agricultural efficiency that would inform his later scholarly work. Roman Wersky liked his time on Mabel Giesek's plantation near Parken so much that, after the war, she hired him to come back and work legitimately on her farm. May 7, 1945. Germany surrendered. The news reached Arkansas camps through official channels and created a strange atmosphere of victory mixed with uncertainty. For American personnel, the war in Europe was over. For the prisoners, it meant only that they were now officially defeated, though practically nothing changed. The prisoners remained in Arkansas. Cotton still needed picking, timber still needed cutting. The labor shortage had not magically resolved with Germany's surrender. Farmers lobbied Congress to keep the POW program running through 1946, arguing that their economic survival depended on it. The last year felt surreal. The prisoners no longer fought for Hitler. Some camps operated without guards, relying on civilian foremen to supervise work details. The men who had been enemies were now just workers, undocumented laborers keeping Arkansas agriculture afloat, while American soldiers slowly returned home from Europe and the Pacific. But the end came inevitably. By summer 1946, trains began carrying prisoners to ports in New Jersey for repatriation. Many refused to eat in the days before departure, terrified of returning to Germany looking too well fed. They had heard the stories: food shortages, cities in rubble, millions displaced. American abundance had made them soft, and they knew their families would be starving. Werner Gebauer smuggled letters back to Arkansas from Germany, thanking E.D. Gregory for treatment he could barely articulate. One woman who received her uncle back from an Arkansas camp noted he looked healthier than any civilian in Germany, far better than the walking dead who returned from Soviet camps. The contrast told a story about different kinds of captivity. The letters kept coming. Through 1946, 1947, 1948, former prisoners wrote to the farmers who had employed them. The notes, preserved now at the University of Arkansas Special Collections, reveal yearning for something lost. Several asked directly for jobs, begging to return to America and work legitimately on the farms where they had been prisoners. One letter reached Frank Sloan's father in Greene County, a former prisoner asking if he could come back to work the farm. The family never heard from him again and did not know if he ever made it to America. But the request itself spoke volumes about the impression Arkansas had made on men who arrived expecting brutality. The Arkansas experience was not unique. Across America, similar stories played out. But Arkansas, with its desperate labor needs and its particular brand of Southern hospitality mixed with segregation's bitter realities, created conditions where transformation happened, despite everyone's best efforts to prevent it. Physical evidence of the POW presence in Arkansas faded quickly. The camps were dismantled by 1947, buildings auctioned off or repurposed. Arkansas A&M College in Monticello used former POW barracks to house married veterans returning to school on the GI Bill. The land returned to agricultural use, plowed under and planted over, but artifacts remained. Concrete foundations at sites like the Jonesboro camp, barely visible now beneath grass and soil. A utility pole that Parker, who bought the land in the 1950s, identified as the last visible remnant of the CCC camp that became a POW facility. A wooden cane, either broken or made for a very short German soldier, found by children playing where barracks once stood. In Kaiser, Arkansas, the City Hall displays artworks made by German prisoners. Oil paintings, wood carvings, a wooden chest still used for storage. These objects occupy a strange space in Arkansas history. They are beautiful. They were made by enemy soldiers. They represent a moment when humanity broke through the structures of war. The Bassett campsite preserves only a concrete gate and a historical marker. Adjacent to U.S. Route 61, which stretches from Minnesota to Louisiana, the gate stands as a memorial to a moment when 23,000 German and Italian prisoners spent years picking cotton in the Mississippi River Delta. Most Arkansans drive past without knowing what happened there. The real legacy lived in memory and in changed perspectives. Arkansas farmers who had employed German POWs told their children and grandchildren about young men who were supposed to be monsters but turned out to be just boys far from home. The children who watched prisoners work on family farms carried those images into adulthood, complicating their understanding of enemies and allies. Edwin Pelds returned to Chicago after the war and built a life. He married Judith, raised 10 children, worked 42 years at R.R. Donnelly Company. He died in 2023 at 94, surrounded by family, his time in Arkansas a distant memory softened by decades. But he never forgot the kindness. In his memoir, published years after the war, he tried to explain what it meant to be treated with Christian charity when you expected death. The University of Arkansas preserves collections that tell pieces of the story. Letters between E.D. Gregory and the prisoners who worked his land. Photographs of Germans in mess halls and work details. Official reports tracking population numbers and work productivity. Historical quarterlies containing memoirs and academic analyses. These documents sit in climate-controlled archives, available to researchers trying to understand what happened when enemies became, if not friends, then at least human beings in each other's eyes. Some former prisoners did return to America after the war. They launched professional careers. They renewed acquaintances with former captors. They brought families to show them the places where they had spent years as prisoners, learning that propaganda lies, and that kindness matters more than ideology. The camps themselves faded into local history, stories told at county historical societies, and preserved in university archives. Most young Arkansans do not know that their state once housed 23,000 German POWs. The generation that remembers is passing away. Soon only documents and artifacts will remain, to tell the story of what happened when Rommel's Africa Corps came to Arkansas and found something completely unexpected. Historians debate what it all meant. Was it successful re-education? Did treating German prisoners humanely contribute to post-war democratization of Germany? Or was it simply pragmatic labor policy that happened to have psychological side effects? The numbers tell part of the story. Arkansas farms stayed solvent during critical years. Timber companies filled orders. The state economy did not collapse despite massive labor shortages. The Geneva Convention was followed, mostly, protecting both American reputation and ensuring reciprocal treatment of American POWs in German camps. But the human story matters more than economic statistics. Werner Gebauer, Fritz Becker, Helmut Schultz, Gustav Menke, Gerhard Schnauze, Werner Schmitz, Rolf Tienemann, Alfred Schiersch, and thousands like them arrived in Arkansas believing Americans were savages. They left knowing better. That knowledge did not erase their participation in Hitler's war. It did not absolve them of responsibility for the regime they had served. But it complicated the narrative in ways that mattered. In a world shaped by propaganda and dehumanization, the Arkansas POW camps accidentally became laboratories for a different kind of warfare. The kind fought with bacon and eggs instead of bullets, with fair wages and cold water instead of brutality, with peanut butter smuggled in canteens instead of torture in interrogation rooms. Arkansas, 1999. An elderly man stepped off a plane in Little Rock with his wife beside him. Felix R. Gabriel, former Luftwaffe airman, former POW, now a doctor of law from the University of Vienna, had returned to see the places where he had spent years as a prisoner. The Arlington Hotel still stood in Hot Springs, though he no longer washed dishes there. The camp at Lake Catherine was long gone, returned to parkland and trees. An interviewer asked him the question that mattered. Were you well treated? Gabriel's response came in accented English mixed with German. Well treated? Yeah. If I think I would be in Russia, it would be horrible. There, it was wonderful. Wonderful. A strange word for captivity. But Gabriel was not alone in that assessment. Dozens of former prisoners expressed similar sentiments in letters and memoirs and interviews given decades after the war. They remembered kindness when they expected cruelty. They remembered abundance when they expected starvation. They remembered being treated like human beings when Nazi propaganda had promised they would be treated like animals. The Arkansas experiment in POW treatment succeeded not because of official policy, but despite it. It succeeded because farmers needed workers and treated them fairly. Because guards were farm boys who shared cigarettes instead of enforcing rigid brutality. Because someone decided to give peanut butter to prisoners who exceeded their cotton quotas. Because small acts of human decency accumulated over months and years until they became something larger than the sum of their parts. 23,000 German and Italian prisoners passed through Arkansas between 1943 and 1946. They came expecting prison. What they found changed their lives forever. And in changing, they proved something the architects of the POW program never anticipated. That the most powerful weapon against fascism was not bombs or bullets, but simple human kindness offered consistently, even to enemies. The sun still rises over the Arkansas Delta. Cotton still grows in fields where prisoners once worked, and somewhere in archives and attics across Europe and America, letters remain, written in German and English, telling a story about a time when war brought men together instead of driving them apart.